Catherine Cook Briggs lived in the small town of Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1917, she noticed that her future son-in-law, who was to marry her daughter Isabel Briggs Myers, had a very different personality than everyone else in the family. After this observation, she started getting into reading biographies, and eventually created a personality typology. That is, a system of classification based on types or categories. Later, in 1921, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in Switzerland, the psychiatrist Carl Jung published his book, Psychological Types, which Briggs would later read in 1923 when it was translated into English. After incorporating Jung's ideas into her own system, Briggs developed the MBTI system you might recognize today. Her daughter, Isabel Briggs Myers, joined this project and eventually took it over, hence the title, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Neither Catherine nor her daughter were formally educated in psychology, and were entirely self-taught, which already raises some questions. As mentioned before, MBTI has a lot to owe to the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. Following interactions with a number of his patients, he speculated that people's psychology is made up of 4 primary functions: sensation, intuition, feeling, and thinking, and that one of these 4 aspects is dominant in any given person most of the time. The 4 categories are introversion-extroversion, sensing-intuition, thinking-feeling, and judging-perceiving. So everyone has a dominant quality from each of these categories, leading to 16 total personality types. Jung believed that there were 2 dichotomous pairs of cognitive functions, the rational judging functions, like thinking and feeling, and the irrational perceiving functions, sensation and intuition. Jung understood personality to be similar to left or right-handedness. It's something people are born with, and is mostly unchanged by experience. Before I start criticizing MBTI, I want to be charitable to Jung. He didn't envision these ideas to be understood through questionnaires, so the MBTI system you recognize now does not fully capture what he was going for. But even Jung's system is entirely hypothetical and speculative. Jung's work is worth understanding and paying attention to if you want to get into psychology, but it's not the result of concrete science. In the early 20th century, psychology didn't involve the rigid, controlled studies that it does today. The field was dominated by psychoanalysis, which emphasized clinical practice and later speculation. These techniques, in my opinion, more closely mirror philosophy than they do psychology. As someone who spends a lot of time thinking about philosophy, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it results in less concrete proof of the ideas. The other dominant attitude in psychology at the time was behaviorism, a perspective that didn't want any of this psychoanalytic speculation, and only understood the mind as a simple input-output or stimulus-response system. It wasn't until the 1950s that the cognitive revolution happened. New perspectives were emerging in linguistics, neuroscience, and computer science, and these ideas narrowed the scope of psychology to more rigid scientific inquiry, without ignoring the mind like the behaviorists did. No one person was responsible for this revolution, but Noam Chomsky was a very important figure in its development. He wasn't a big fan of behaviorism, and found it very short-sighted. He wanted to reincorporate mental functioning while also approaching the mind from a more rigidly scientific perspective. So to recap, MBTI is based on a kinda antiquated psychoanalytical framework that was modified and turned into a questionnaire by 2 people who weren't psychologists. Nowadays, MBTI is a very popular quiz that people take online to find out more about their personality. Most of the scientific research supporting it is from the Center of Applications of Psychological Type in the Journal of Psychological Type. That organization and that journal is run by none other than the Myers-Briggs Foundation, which obviously raises some questions about bias and conflict of interest. MBTI has been widely criticized as pseudoscience, and most academic psychologists you would find at a university don't support it. I took a number of psychology courses at university, and not only did MBTI never come up, but we also barely talked about the psychoanalysts. Annie Murphy-Paul, a former senior editor for Psychology Today, compared personality tests to phrenology, a discredited 19th century personality instrument that measured mental traits by examining the 27 bumps on a person's head. MBTI isn't very valid. That is, it doesn't have much predictive power. You can't take someone's MBTI type and predict what they might do in a given situation. The system is also not very reliable. It gives different results for the same person at different times. If Carl Jung was right that personality was like left or right-handedness, this wouldn't happen. But my MBTI type describes me perfectly, you say. This is pretty normal for psychological tests. Most people that take the MBTI test are astonished by how closely their type description fits their life. This is the Forer effect, the natural tendency of people to assign detail and specific meaning to generalized statements or events. Ideas can be presented in such a way that they're pretty much true for everyone, like, while sometimes you spend hours talking to people, on other days you can be quite content with your own company. This just describes all human beings. This effect works because most people don't see these statements as generalizations. They look for specific examples in their own life to match this generalization. This kind of pattern reminds me of something, and you might notice that too if you can read the title of this video. Astrology, the fortune cookies from space. This probably needs no introduction, since astrology is more popular today than it's ever been. Nowadays, it's hard to escape it, particularly if you're a user of dating apps. Astrology is the idea that we can understand people's personalities and behaviors by studying the movements and relative positions of celestial objects. The discipline was a pretty big deal in early human civilization. The Hindus, Chinese, and the Maya all developed sophisticated astrological systems to predict what happens here on Earth. And this makes perfect sense from their perspective. They still think Earth is the center of the universe, they don't have telescopes, they don't have the scientific method, and so they look to the night sky for answers. I'd probably do the same. The night sky is pretty breathtaking. Astrology died out as an academic discipline in the early 20th century, when scientists demonstrated that it had little explanatory power and was also unfalsifiable. But later on in the 20th century, with the rise of New Age philosophy and spirituality, astrology had a resurgence through horoscopes published in newspapers. In 1953, Theodore, I hate jazz for some reason, Adorno, did a study on the Los Angeles astrology column, which was part of his project to study capitalist mass culture. He concluded that astrology is a kind of systemic irrationalism, where people are subtly led through flattery and vague generalizations to believe that horoscopes directly apply to them. Here, he's basically describing the Forer effect. Drawing from Karl Marx's phrase, opium of the masses, he called astrology the metaphysic of the dopes. So if we can't look to MBTI or astrology to understand our personality, what can we use? Studying personality is really hard, because humans are unbelievably complicated. If you ask a psych major how to measure personality, they'd probably point you to the Big Five model, which is similar to MBTI, but it has been proven to have predictive power. The Big Five is a statistical model created by Robert McCrae and Paul Costa. These researchers took every adjective describing people that they could find and subjected them to factor analysis, which basically involves statistically determining the similarity between them. So using this, they reduced these adjectives to 5 factors, which each exist on a continuum: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. This system can be used to predict average behavior, rather than what we would 100% do in any given situation. Our behavior is still flexible, and some traits, like neuroticism, lead to much more accurate predictions than the others. There's also the social cognitive perspective, which doesn't think that the Big Five is quite enough to fully capture people's personalities. They claim that our personality traits interact with our current social context to determine our behavior. So our behavior is impacted by our circle of friends, the books you read, the music you listen to, and the YouTubers you watch. This perspective is much more reasonable than the idea that personalities can all be neatly organized into different categories, but it still leaves something out. What is personality to begin with? Well, most people would say it's the characteristics that define the self. But what is the self? The self is supposedly the deep thing inside us that organizes our thoughts, feelings, and actions, and is essentially the center of our personality. A ghostly supervisor who lives inside his head, the thinker of his thoughts, the repository of his memories, the holder of his values, his conscious inner I. But philosophically speaking, it's unclear if the self is even a real thing, or if it's some kind of mental construction that we use to understand our own thoughts and behaviors. The philosopher David Hume didn't believe in a unified self that persists over time, and that essentially there's no you that's the same person from birth to death. Hume understood the self as a collection of perceptions, rather than a unified substantial thing. People call this his bundle theory of self. I'm personally in the camp that the self is an illusion. In fact, I wrote my undergraduate thesis defending this position, which I might make a separate video on in the future. If the self is an illusion, what does this mean for personality? I want to be clear here that I'm not conflating personality and the self. These are very different things, but they are related concepts. In my view, this understanding of the self as an illusion means that personality is not totally rigid and set in stone. We have certain characteristics and dispositions that predict how we might behave in certain situations, which has been partly captured by the Big Five, but fundamentally who we are is constantly changing and shifting through each moment. This is probably why taking the MBTI test leads to different results at different times. One day, you decide to take the test on a rainy Wednesday in 2017, and you come out INFP. And then a few years later, on a sunny Monday in 2019, you come out as ENTJ. People are quick to dismiss astrology as pseudoscience, but will then go on to discuss their MBTI results, taking them completely seriously. The point of this video is to argue that MBTI and astrology are not only equally wrong ways of thinking about personality, but they're also wrong in the exact same way. But at the same time, it's clear that each of these systems have captured people's attention, so people must be getting something out of it, right? An argument that comes up a lot in astrology is that it may not be based in fact, but it forces you to think about yourself, which can allow you to understand yourself better. The same is true of MBTI. It may not be capital T true, but it forces people to introspect about the type of person they are, or want to be, which might be good in some ways. But the key is to take these systems with a grain of salt, and understand that they're not based in fact. Don't take the results too seriously, and don't let it define you. The YouTuber Jreg has made a few videos about the label introvert. Here's a clip I like a lot.
Someone having a panic attack. Are you okay? No, I have to make a phone call. I understand. I get it. I don't like making phone calls. It's hard. It's tough. But it's also not a fundamental aspect of my personality. It's not a core, immovable part of my identity. It's actually something that I could move. I could make better, and I would actually very much like to improve.
As mentioned before, personality is totally malleable. You're not stuck with these characteristics permanently, and they don't fully define who you are. MBTI might be good for introspection, but everyone takes it way too seriously to the point that it becomes counterproductive, and all it does is limit the type of person you can be. So yeah, MBTI is basically astrology. That doesn't make it bad, and it doesn't make you a stupid person if you're interested in it. But it does mean that it's not capital T true, and people should probably stop taking it so seriously.